I should start with the one thing that still makes my hands tense up on the wheel. That night, I crossed paths with a future version of myself. It wasn't a trick of the glass or a dream I misremembered years later. I was driving alone on a narrow back road in New Hampshire, the kind people stop using after dark, when a car identical to mine appeared in the opposite lane. As it got closer, I leaned forward to see who was driving, and for a brief second, lit by my own headlights, I saw my own face, older, tired, and looking straight at me. The road had been empty for miles. No houses, no stores, just trees pressing in from both sides and that kind of country darkness that eats the end of your headlights. I wasn't thinking about anything strange. I was just trying to get home a little faster, taking a shortcut I'd driven 100 times before. That's what still bothers me the most. How ordinary the night started. There was no sense of buildup, no warning. One moment it was just me and the sound of my engine. The next, there were headlights cutting through the black, moving toward me like they didn't quite belong there. As the other car approached, little details started to bother me. The shape of the hood, the way the paint caught the light. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. A perfect copy of my car, down to a faint scratch near the front bumper I was sure no one else would ever notice. I remember my grip tightening on the steering wheel as I squinted through the windshield, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver. And then I saw him. Same nose, same jaw, same way of leaning slightly forward when the road curves. It was me, just a few years further along. We passed each other in less than a second, but somehow that second stretched. His eyes met mine. There was no panic in them, no shock, no "what is happening" kind of fear. Instead, there was something heavier, like resignation, like he already knew exactly how this moment would feel for me. The car swept by, my side mirror rattled, and my heart kicked so hard in my chest that I almost pulled over right there. I might have convinced myself I'd imagined all of it, if not for the license plates. I caught them in my rearview mirror. The numbers were clear, too clear for my mind to have filled them in. The year stamped on that plate was wrong. Not old, not faded. Wrong in a way that doesn't fit inside a normal life. It was a year that hadn't arrived yet. I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do. But from that night on, that empty New Hampshire road stopped being just a shortcut. It became the place where time slipped, just enough for me to see a piece of myself I was never meant to meet. And to this day, I still can't explain that night. By the next morning, I still hadn't slept. I kept replaying the moment on that back road, trying to convince myself it was just fatigue or a trick of the dark. But as I sat at my small kitchen table, listening to the old baseboard heater click to life, nothing about the night felt distant. It was as if the encounter had followed me home, settling in the corners of the house like a shadow that didn't belong to me. The silence felt different too, heavier somehow, like the world was waiting for me to understand something I wasn't prepared for. I made coffee, though I didn't need the caffeine. My hands trembled a little as I poured it, and the sound of it hitting the mug brought back the soft hum of tires on pavement from the night before. I kept wondering if there had been some sign earlier in the drive, some shift in the trees, in the air, in the way the darkness moved, that I'd ignored. But everything about the evening had been painfully normal until it wasn't. That's what unsettled me the most. By mid-morning, I finally decided to retrace my route, not because I expected to see that other car again, but because I needed the reassurance of daylight. I needed to see the road as it really was, just asphalt, paint, and pine trees. The drive felt slower than usual, even though I kept my foot steady on the gas. Every bend felt slightly off, as if the night had rearranged something I couldn't see. I stopped at the exact spot where our cars had passed each other. In the daylight, the place looked harmless, frost clinging to the grass, a soft breeze pushing through bare branches. Nothing strange at all. But standing there, I still felt that thin pressure in the air, the one I couldn't quite put into words. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I didn't imagine the other driver. I didn't misread the face. And whatever year was printed on that license plate wasn't an accident. Something real happened on that road. Something meant for me, though I had no idea why. Hi, my name is Caleb Monroe. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep creating these quiet, strange memories from the edges of time. Have you ever experienced a moment that didn't quite fit the day it happened? Thank you for being here and supporting the channel. Now, let's get back to the story. I drove back home after revisiting that stretch of road, but the rest of the day never settled into anything familiar. Even simple tasks felt slightly misaligned, as if the hours themselves weren't moving the way they should. I folded laundry. I washed the few dishes in the sink. I tried to read, though the words blurred together. Everything looked normal, behaved normal, but none of it felt normal. It was like the world had shifted half an inch to the left while I wasn't looking. By late afternoon, I decided to distract myself with something practical. My car had been sitting outside all day, a thin layer of frost sparkling on the hood each time the sun broke through the clouds. I figured checking the oil or wiping down the interior might give me something solid to focus on, a grounding task, something ordinary in a day that wasn't. But the moment I opened the driver's door, a cold rush of recognition went through me. I had driven this car for years. I knew every sound it made, every small imperfection in the steering wheel, every stubborn click of the blinker. Yet something about the seat felt different, as if it had been adjusted by someone with my height, my build, just not quite my posture. I brushed it off at first, telling myself I could have moved it without thinking. People do small things they don't remember all the time. Still, I leaned closer, studying the alignment. It wasn't just the seat. The mirror had been tilted slightly upward. The radio, which I always kept off, was set to a station I didn't recognize, static with the faintest hint of a voice underneath. And on the passenger side floor mat, there was a pattern in the dust, a faint outline, like the imprint of a shoe that wasn't mine, the kind of shoe I might wear someday. My first instinct was to step back, close the door, pretend none of this meant anything. That's what a reasonable person would have done. But instead, I stayed there with my hand still on the handle, breath fogging the cold air. Because I knew the truth beneath the unease. Whoever had driven that other car, whoever I had passed on that dark road, hadn't just brushed against my life and vanished. It felt like he had come closer than I realized, maybe closer than he should have. I stood there longer than I probably should have, one hand on the open door, the other hovering just above the steering wheel. It was a strange feeling, not fear exactly, but a quiet kind of dread, the kind that doesn't rush at you all at once. It settles in slowly, like cold air filling a room. I couldn't shake the idea that someone had been inside my car after the encounter. Someone who knew how I sat, how far back I liked the seat, where I kept my hands. Someone who knew me well enough to mimic those details, but not perfectly. Eventually, I climbed into the driver's seat, telling myself I needed proof before letting my mind make assumptions. The air inside was colder than outside, as if it hadn't been open for days, which didn't make sense. I had driven it just that morning before heading back to the road. I turned the key halfway, letting the dashboard lights glow faintly before starting the engine. Everything looked normal, same worn fabric, same faded dials, until I noticed the odometer. It was off by 3 miles. I froze. That stretch of road where I had passed my future self was nearly 9 miles from my house. If I had driven there and back, sure, that would explain it. But I hadn't. I had taken my truck earlier that day, the old one I used during the winter months. This car, hadn't been driven since the night of the encounter. I stared at the numbers, blinking, rereading them, hoping they would change if I looked long enough. But they stayed the same. 3 extra miles, added sometime between last night and this afternoon. I leaned back slowly, the cold fabric pressing into my shoulders, and the silence pressed in with it. A few moments passed before I finally reached for the radio. The static was still there, but now I could hear something beneath it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly tapping metal with a finger or pen. I turned the dial, expecting it to vanish as the station shifted, but it didn't. The tapping followed the tuning, sitting under every frequency like it was buried in the static itself. I shut it off immediately. My heartbeat felt too loud in the quiet car. I stepped out and closed the door carefully, listening to the familiar click of the latch. The driveway looked the same as always. Tire tracks frozen into the dirt, thin snow piled along the fence. No footprints around the car besides mine. But the normalcy of the scene made everything feel even more wrong. Whoever or whatever had driven those 3 miles hadn't bothered leaving evidence, or maybe they didn't need to. I took a few steps toward my porch before stopping and turning back to the car. The imprint on the floor mat, that faint outline of a shoe. caught the sunlight at a new angle, and for the first time since the encounter, I felt certain of something I didn't want to believe. The other version of me hadn't just been passing through that night. He had come back. I backed away from the car slowly, as if turning my back on it too quickly might invite something I wasn't ready to face. The shoe imprint, the adjusted seat, the altered odometer, they weren't the kind of details that could be brushed off as imagination. They were physical, measurable, undeniable, and they pointed to one possibility I still wasn't ready to say out loud. Someone had been inside my life when I wasn't looking. Someone who walked like me, sat like me, someone who might have been me. The cold tightened around my neck as I stepped onto the porch. I'd always liked winter in New Hampshire. The quiet mornings, the stillness of the snow, the way the whole world seemed to whisper instead of speak. But that day, the quiet felt oppressive, as if the whole landscape were holding its breath with me. My house, with its peeling paint and slanted porch steps, had always been a place of comfort. Now it felt like a witness I couldn't trust. Inside, I went straight to the small desk near the window, where I kept a notebook for errands and reminders. I opened it, hoping to ground myself with something familiar. That's when I noticed a page torn out, cleanly, carefully, with no scraps left behind. I hadn't touched the notebook in days. I certainly hadn't removed a page. I flipped through the remaining sheets, checking if I had made a note recently that might explain it. Nothing. Just a blank space where something should have been. A missing moment. A place where memory should have existed. A slow unease spread across my chest. The idea came to me instinctively, almost automatically. What if the torn page had contained something he wrote? Not a stranger, not a break-in, but the other version of me. Older, tired-eyed, already familiar with the moment I was living now. The thought rattled me more than anything I'd seen that day. In an attempt to clear my mind, I walked to the sink and ran the tap, splashing cold water on my face. For a moment, the house sounded normal again. Pipes humming, heater ticking, the low murmur of wind pushing against the siding. But when I shut off the water, I heard something faint from the back door. A soft creak, like weight shifting against old hinges. I turned slowly. The door was closed, locked, but the air around it felt disturbed somehow, as if it had moved a minute earlier, as if someone had come in or stepped out or paused there long enough to listen. My heart thudded once, hard, and a thought settled into my mind with a clarity that made my stomach twist. The version of me I saw on that road hadn't just passed by in some accidental crossing of timelines. He had been inside this house. He had touched my life from the inside. And whatever he came here to do, it wasn't finished yet. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the lamp on, staring at the faint water stains on the ceiling, listening to the slow ticks of the baseboard heater, as if they could anchor me to something normal. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw the other version of myself on that road, the older me, the quiet resignation in his eyes, the way he looked at me like someone revisiting a memory rather than witnessing a moment for the first time. And that expression unsettled me more than the impossible reality of the encounter itself. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and sat by the bedroom window, watching the empty street below. The night had that dense stillness that only comes in the deepest hours of winter, when even the wind seems reluctant to move. My truck sat in the driveway under a dusting of snow. Beside it, my car, the one that had changed while I wasn't looking, seemed harmless in the orange wash of the street lamp. Ordinary, familiar, quiet, but I kept imagining a second version of myself sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, waiting for the right moment to step back into my life. As dawn crept in, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had misread the odometer. Maybe the shoe imprint had been there before. Maybe the back door had simply shifted in the cold. That's what I told myself as I forced my routine to begin. Shower, coffee, coat, boots. But every small sound felt wrong. The kettle's whistle too sharp, the floorboards too soft under my feet, the ticking clock too slow. I told myself I would go to work like normal, pretend that everything was fine until it felt true. I grabbed my keys, and for a moment I hesitated between the truck and the car. The truck felt safer, older, louder, incapable of subtlety. The car felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. So I made the easy choice and walked toward the truck. That's when I noticed the footprints. 2 sets, side by side. One pair was mine, heavy, slightly angled outward. the sort of prints you leave without thinking as you move around your own home. But the second pair rested beside them, faint and crisp, as if made hours earlier in the cold. Longer strides, deeper impressions, and the pattern on the sole matched exactly the faint outline I had seen inside the car the day before. My breath fogged in a slow, unsteady cloud. The prints didn't lead to the street or around the house. They led directly to the passenger door of my car, and then vanished. No continuation, no retreat, just an abrupt ending, as if the person who made them had stepped out of existence the moment they reached the vehicle, or stepped in. A quiet realization settled over me, colder than the morning air. He hadn't just entered my house. He had been watching my life from closer than I imagined, and maybe I wasn't the only one awake last night. I crouched beside the footprints for a long minute, letting the cold seep through my jeans. There was something deeply unsettling about how clean the impressions were. Sharp edges, clear patterns, like they'd been left by someone who wasn't trying to hide at all. And yet, the way they ended so abruptly felt anything but natural. It reminded me of a sentence cut in the middle of a word, or a song that stops before the last note resolves. Something unfinished, something interrupted. My first instinct was to call someone, maybe a friend, or even the police. But the idea dissolved as quickly as it surfaced. What would I report? There's a second version of me walking around, leaving footprints in my driveway. I'd end up with questions I couldn't answer, explanations I couldn't give, and a look from everyone that would make me feel even more alone in the truth I already doubted myself for believing. I stood slowly, brushing frost off my hands, and looked around the yard as if expecting to see movement in the trees or the faint suggestion of someone slipping out of sight. But everything remained still. The pine branches barely stirred. The air felt too heavy to carry sound. Even the distant hum of the highway seemed muted, like the world was dimming itself around me. I approached the car again, not to get in this time, but to study it. The thin layer of frost on the windshield had been disturbed on the passenger side, faint arcs where a sleeve or shoulder might have brushed it. I reached out and touched the glass, half expecting it to feel warm, but it was cold as stone. Still, the disturbance was real. Someone had leaned there, someone familiar. I circled to the back of the car, tracing the edge of the trunk with my fingers, as if looking for something left behind. And there, tucked just under the rubber seal, I felt the corner of a piece of paper. My heart kicked. I pulled it free carefully. It was a small sheet torn from a notebook, the same size as the missing page from my own. The handwriting was mine. There was no question about it. The shape of the letters, the slant, the pressure, every detail matched the way I'd written notes my whole life. But I had never written the words on the page. Just one line, written unevenly, as if the hand that wrote it wasn't steady. Don't follow the wrong morning. I read it again and again, waiting for the sentence to make sense. It didn't. The phrasing was strange, off-tempo, something you'd hear in a dream and forget by lunchtime. And yet I felt a small, involuntary shiver move up my spine. I wasn't sure which part of it frightened me more, the warning itself, or the quiet certainty that it was meant for me. A message left by a version of myself who had already lived something I hadn't reached yet, and he wanted me to avoid it. I must have stood there for 5 full minutes, staring at that torn page as if the words might rearrange themselves into something clearer. Don't follow the wrong morning. It felt like a riddle whispered through fog, something I was supposed to understand instinctively but couldn't quite grasp. The handwriting, my handwriting, made the message even harder to ignore. A note from myself, but not from any version of me that existed in this lifetime. Eventually, I slipped the paper into my coat pocket and stepped back, letting the morning air fill my lungs. The cold stung, but it grounded me in a way nothing else had. I traced the footprints again with my eyes, following their brief trajectory until they vanished near the car door. There were no other markings, no trail leading away, no disturbance in the snow beyond that small area. It was as if the person who left them had stepped out of the world the moment the note was placed. Still, something about the phrase clung to me, pulling at the edge of my mind. The wrong morning. It implied choices, diverging paths, versions of the day that weren't meant to be crossed. I thought about the night before, the moment I'd passed the older version of myself on that lonely road. The look in his eyes lingered with me. Not fear, not confusion, something more like sorrow. I went back inside, locking the door behind me with a carefulness I normally never bothered with. The house felt too quiet again, as if something unseen had just slipped out moments before I entered. I stood in the small hallway, coat still on, and looked around with new suspicion. Not paranoia, exactly, but caution, as though I might catch another version of my life standing in a doorway, waiting for me to notice it. In the kitchen, the coffee pot was still warm. Strange. I was sure I'd turned it off before stepping outside. I hovered my hand above it, feeling the heat rising. It wasn't scalding, but it was fresh enough to suggest it had been turned on again recently. My breath caught in my throat. Maybe it was just forgetfulness. Maybe I had absent-mindedly hit the switch. But something in me resisted that explanation. The quiet tension in the house felt too deliberate, as if the moment had been arranged to draw my attention, as if I wasn't alone in shaping the morning. I walked to the table and sat down, pulling the torn note from my pocket. I flattened it gently, tracing the letters with my finger. The ink had pressed deeper into the paper at the start of the sentence, weakening toward the end, like whoever wrote it had hesitated before finishing, or like they'd been in a hurry. And then another thought chilled me. What if the warning was not about today? What if it was about a morning I hadn't lived yet, but he had? The house creaked softly, and for a moment I felt certain that whatever version of myself had been here was still close, hovering at the edge of the day I was about to step into. I spent most of that morning moving through the house like someone walking through a dream they're trying to stay awake inside. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow a little too still. I kept replaying the note in my mind, "Don't follow the wrong morning," trying to decipher whether it pointed to something I had already done or something waiting for me down a path I hadn't yet taken. The thought stayed with me like a quiet pressure behind my ribs. I finally decided I needed to get out of the house. Staying inside felt like letting the day tighten its grip around me. I grabbed my coat, pocketed the torn note, and stepped out into the crisp winter air. The sunlight was thin, almost fragile, filtering through pale clouds that stretched over the sky like old fabric. Everything felt muted, as if the world were conserving its voice. I didn't plan a destination, I just drove. My truck, with its rattling door and uneven engine hum, felt more trustworthy than the car. The familiar discomfort grounded me. For a while, the roads were empty, just long stretches of cracked asphalt and snow-dusted fields. But as I crossed into the outskirts of town, I noticed something unusual. People were out, but they seemed off somehow. Not in appearance, in movement. They walked a little slower, turned their heads a little later than you'd expect. A man scraping ice off his windshield paused mid-motion as my truck passed, as if he weren't sure what he was seeing. A woman carrying groceries stepped aside at the last second, her eyes following me in a way that made me instinctively check the rearview mirror. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't alarm. It was recognition. Not of me, necessarily, but of something about me. I shook the thought off and drove toward town square. That's when I caught sight of the clock tower. It had always been reliable, an old mechanical thing that never seemed to lose time. But now, as I slowed at the intersection, I saw the minute hand twitch backward just a fraction of an inch before correcting itself, a single stutter in time. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it, but as I watched, it happened again. Subtle, like a breath caught in the gears. Nobody else seemed to notice. People walked past as if nothing were wrong. The world moved on, ignoring the small fracture in its rhythm. I parked and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The torn note in my pocket felt heavier, as though the words were finally beginning to attach themselves to something real. Don't follow the wrong morning. What if the warning wasn't about danger? What if it was about alignment, about choosing the morning that matched the life I was supposed to live? As I stepped out of the truck, a cold breeze cut through my coat, carrying with it the faintest echo of a sensation I'd felt on that lonely road the night before. A moment arriving too early, or me arriving too late. I walked through town with my hands in my coat pockets, trying to look like someone who had simply come out for fresh air. But the feeling from the clock tower, that small slip in time, stayed with me like a quiet echo behind every sound. The torn note in my pocket crinkled with each step, the paper almost warm from the heat of my body. I resisted the urge to read it again, afraid the words would feel different if I stared at them too long. The sidewalks were half cleared from an earlier snowfall. A few shops had their lights on, though most were still closed. It should have felt like any ordinary morning in New Hampshire, but there was a strangeness woven into it, something subtle but undeniable, a slight misalignment in the way people moved, the way sounds carried, the way the air felt too still around me. Near the corner pharmacy, I saw old Mr. Tisdale sweeping the entrance. He'd lived in the town longer than anyone I knew, one of those men who seemed older than the buildings themselves. His broom paused mid-sweep when he noticed me. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He just stared at me for a few seconds, eyes narrowing slightly, like he was trying to place a memory he wasn't sure belonged to him. "Cold morning," I said, trying to break the tension. He blinked, as if waking from a thought. "Colder than most," he replied, but his eyes lingered on me even after I walked past, following me with a look I couldn't quite read. Not fear, not confusion, almost familiarity. I kept walking until I reached the small bookstore at the end of Main Street. Its owner, Mrs. Letheridge, was unlocking the door. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard me approach, and for a moment, her expression tightened. Just a flicker, but enough to notice. "Morning, Caleb," she said, forcing a smile. "You're in early," I replied. "Felt like it." She hesitated, then added, "Everything all right?" The question hung there. Simple, casual, but weighted with something else. Something she didn't want to articulate. I nodded slowly. "Fine. Just needed to get out of the house." She studied me for a moment longer, then unlocked the door and slipped inside. I continued down the sidewalk until the quiet felt heavy on my shoulders. A dull ache settled at the base of my skull, the kind you get when you're trying too hard to connect dots that weren't meant to be connected yet. I stopped near a bench and lowered myself onto it, exhaling a long breath into the cold air. That's when I noticed the payphone across the street, the one I hadn't seen anyone use in years. Its metal frame was frosted, the receiver hanging crookedly, but the small digital display above the keypad was lit, flickering, resetting, then landing on a sequence of numbers I recognized instantly, the year printed on the license plate of the car driven by my older self. My breath caught in my throat. The display blinked again, once, twice, then went dark, as if it had exhausted the last bit of energy needed to send a message I wasn't meant to ignore. A quiet certainty settled over me. The timeline I was standing in was starting to slip, and something, or someone, was trying to show me where. I stayed on that bench longer than I intended, staring at the payphone as if the metal frame might shift again or the display might flicker back to life. But the screen remained dark, lifeless, as though it had never been illuminated at all. A few cars passed, their engines muffled by the cold morning air. People walked by without glancing at the phone, without noticing the faint warmth rising from the receiver where frost had melted prematurely. Whatever message had been sent, it was meant for me alone. The year on the display kept echoing in my mind, connecting itself to the moment on the road, to the warning in my pocket, to the footprints in my driveway. I didn't understand the pattern yet, but I could feel it forming, like a picture slowly developing in a tray, shapes emerging before meaning arrived. Something about my life was being nudged, pushed, guided even, but I couldn't tell if it was towards safety or something more complicated. A distant church bell chimed the hour, shaking me out of my thoughts. I stood and decided to head back toward the truck. My hands felt stiff, almost numb, but it wasn't just from the cold. There was a weight settling in them, a tremor that didn't feel like fear so much as recognition, like my body knew something my mind was still trying to name. As I walked, I became aware of a faint sensation trailing behind me. Not footsteps, not movement. More like the subtle pressure of someone walking too close in a dream. I didn't turn around. I didn't break stride. But my heart beat faster in a way that felt strangely familiar. When I reached the truck, I grabbed the door handle and paused. The faint imprint of a handprint marked the frost on the window, larger than mine. The fingers set at an angle I didn't recognize. The glass around it had melted slightly, as if the mark had been made only moments earlier. I looked up and down the street. No one. No sign of anything out of place. Just the quiet morning and the subtle hum of a world pretending it hadn't changed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the torn note. The words suddenly felt heavier, as if infused with new meaning. "Don't follow the wrong morning." I whispered them aloud, half hoping hearing my own voice might make them clearer. It didn't. Instead, another thought surfaced, uninvited but sharp. What if the warning wasn't telling me which morning to avoid, but which one I had already stepped into? I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door. The handprint on the glass blurred as the window fogged from my breath. I turned the key, but before I shifted into gear, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, less than a heartbeat, I thought I saw the outline of someone standing at the edge of the street. Not close enough to identify, just a darker shape against the snow. By the time I blinked, it was gone, but the sensation lingered. I wasn't navigating this day alone. Something was walking alongside me, something that knew where I was heading long before I did. I drove home slowly, partly because the roads were still slick with patches of frozen runoff, but mostly because I felt as if the world had become fragile in some way, like a thin sheet of ice stretched over something deep and shifting beneath. Every mile felt longer than it should have, every turn more deliberate. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see that dark outline again, trailing just out of reach. But the road behind me stayed empty. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the quiet was almost startling. The air was still, heavy, as if the morning had settled into a hushed pause. My house, familiar, aging, uneven, looked unchanged, but I no longer trusted appearances. Not after the footprints, not after the missing page, not after the payphone. I stepped out of the truck and felt the soft crunch of the snow beneath my boots. As I approached the front door, I hesitated. A faint strip of light leaked from under the frame, warm and golden against the winter morning. I distinctly remembered turning off every light before leaving. That detail lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly. The living room was empty, but it felt lived in, more than usual. A mug sat on the coffee table, a mug I hadn't used in days, with a thin curl of steam rising from inside. I moved closer and touched the side. Warm. My pulse thudded in my ears. There was only one explanation that made sense, and it was the one I didn't want to accept. The other version of me had been here since I left. I scanned the room for signs of disturbance. Nothing obvious, just subtle shifts. A throw blanket folded differently on the couch. A book I hadn't opened in months sitting slightly off-center on the shelf. My jacket, one I'd left in the bedroom, now hanging neatly by the door. I moved into the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly. A chair had been pulled out at the table, angled in a way I hadn't left it. A faint aroma of toasted bread lingered in the air. I reached out and touched the toaster. The metal was still warm. He'd eaten here, sat here, moved through my life with the familiarity of someone who belonged, and that's what unsettled me most. There was no sense of intrusion, no violence, no disorder. Everything felt careful, considered, as if he knew where things should go, as if he knew me better than I knew myself. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breath. Every second that passed made the house feel smaller, as if the air itself were folding inward. I glanced toward the hallway and felt a faint prickle at the back of my neck, a subtle awareness that something had shifted behind me. That's when I heard it, a soft creak from the floorboards in the direction of my bedroom. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to tell me I wasn't alone in the house. Not anymore. I didn't move at first. I just stood in the kitchen listening. The house was old. Every winter it shifted, creaked, breathed in its own way. But this sound wasn't part of the house settling. It was weight, a deliberate shift of weight on worn floorboards, the kind that carries the memory of a person more than the presence of a person. I felt the air change, the faintest disturbance drifting through the hallway, like the warmth of someone passing behind you in a crowd. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step away from the counter. Each footstep felt heavy, slow, as if the air around me resisted movement. The hallway seemed longer than usual, stretched by the tension in my chest. I reached the doorway of my bedroom and hesitated. The door was open by an inch. I never left doors open. It was a habit I'd had since childhood. Something about closed doors made me feel grounded, as if I knew where things began and ended. But now, the thin sliver of darkness felt like an invitation. I pushed the door open gently. The bedroom appeared empty at first glance. The curtains were still drawn, letting in a muted gray light. The blanket on the bed was smooth except for a single shifted corner. And on the nightstand, where I usually left my alarm clock, something else sat instead, something that didn't belong. My watch. Not the one I wore every day, but the older one I kept in a drawer and hadn't touched in years. A gift from my father. I froze, staring at it. It was wound, ticking softly, even though I hadn't wound it since the early 90s. The sound was steady and faint, almost tender, but it felt impossibly loud in that silent room. I stepped closer. The watch hands weren't marking the current time. They were set several hours ahead. Not fast, not misaligned. Ahead, almost deliberately. A quiet message in the language of seconds. My throat tightened. I picked it up slowly, the metal warm from someone else's touch. The warmth unsettled me more than the ticking. It meant he had held it recently, my older self, moving through the house with a familiarity I couldn't replicate. I sat on the bed, feeling the weight of the watch in my palm. The room felt smaller, denser, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to understand. My eyes drifted toward the dresser. The top drawer was open by a few inches. I didn't open it. I approached it carefully, bracing myself for what I thought I might find. Not something dangerous, not a threat, something intimate, something personal, something that belonged to the version of me I hadn't become yet. Inside, lying perfectly centered on neatly folded shirts, was a photograph. The edges were worn, the colors muted, and when I lifted it, the breath left my lungs. It was me, older, more tired, standing somewhere I didn't recognize. But what froze me in place wasn't the background. It was the date printed in the corner, a date 3 years in the future. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I just sat there with the photograph in my hand, staring at the date printed in red ink along the bottom edge. My mind kept trying to rearrange the numbers into something familiar, something less impossible, but they refused to change. The date was clear, crisp, and undeniable. 3 years ahead of the morning I was standing in now. The version of me in the picture looked older, yes, but not in the way time normally ages a person. There was a weight behind the eyes, a tiredness that didn't look worn or defeated, but resigned, as if he'd accepted something long before the moment the photograph had been taken. His shoulders carried a subtle forward tilt, a posture I didn't recognize in myself yet. And there was something else, something about the setting. He was standing beside a stretch of road, not unlike the one where I'd crossed paths with him the first time. A lonely place, pines lining the background, the sky washed in muted winter light, but the road markers were unfamiliar. The angle of the hills didn't match any place I knew around town. It was a place I hadn't been to yet, or a place I wasn't meant to go. My hand trembled slightly as I set the photograph beside me. I looked at the open drawer, then at the watch still ticking in my palm. Steady, persistent, as if marking a rhythm meant only for me. The ticking seemed louder now, syncing with the after-image of the older version of myself standing alone on that strange road, waiting for something I didn't understand. A faint creak in the hallway made me turn my head sharply. This time, the sound wasn't distant or subtle. It was close, just outside the bedroom door. Instinctively, I held my breath, listening as the quiet settled again. The house didn't feel empty. It felt paused, like a scene waiting for the next line of a script I didn't know I was supposed to follow. I stood slowly, the floorboards cold under my feet. The photograph remained where I placed it, the watch ticking softly like a reminder or warning. I stepped into the hallway. Nothing. No figure, no shadow. Just the familiar dim light and the hum of the heater, but the air felt disturbed, as if someone had moved through it only moments earlier. I walked toward the kitchen, the weight of the photograph still lingering in my thoughts. When I reached the counter, I noticed something new, an indentation on the wooden surface, small but unmistakable, the kind that forms when someone rests their hand there while leaning over. Another presence, another trace left behind, and beneath it, placed with quiet intention, was a second note, folded once, cleanly, precisely. My chest tightened. I unfolded it carefully. Same handwriting, same uneven pressure, same ink. This one had only 2 words. Not yet. The message felt like a cold whisper against the back of my neck, a reminder that whatever was happening wasn't over. And maybe the worst part was the realization growing slowly, unavoidably inside me. The older version of myself wasn't trying to warn me from a distance. He was trying to guide me, from somewhere just ahead of where I stood. I stayed at the kitchen counter for a long time, the second note resting in my hand like a small, undeniable truth. Not yet. The meaning seemed both simple and impossibly complicated. A boundary, a pause, a warning delivered in the gentlest way possible. I read the words again, hoping their tone might shift into something clearer, but they remained steady, patient, like someone telling me to wait for the moment the rest of the picture would come into focus. I slipped the note into my coat pocket beside the first one, feeling the soft crinkle of both pieces of paper. 2 messages from a version of myself that existed somewhere beyond the rules I understood. 2 threads pulling me towards something I couldn't fully see. I moved through the house slowly, more aware now of the way the air felt in each room. It was subtle, but I could sense it. The faint residue of someone else's presence lingering in corners, like warmth left behind on a seat long after a person stands. I wasn't scared. That was the strange part. The fear I expected never came. What I felt instead was something closer to grief, though I couldn't explain why. A softness beneath the unease, a sadness woven through the mystery. When I stepped outside again, the day had brightened slightly. The sky was pale and cold, and the branches of the tall pines along my property swayed just enough to scatter thin flakes of snow across the driveway. My truck sat where I left it, familiar and comforting, but my eyes drifted instead toward the car, the one identical to the one my older self had driven. I walked toward it without really deciding to, drawn by something I didn't have the language for. The car looked ordinary under the winter sunlight, the frost on the windshield beginning to melt. But as I reached the driver's side door, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me, like stepping into a moment I had lived before. I opened the door. The seat had been readjusted again, just slightly, barely more than an inch forward. A position I never used, a position that matched the older version of me from the photograph. On the dashboard, tucked under the edge of the speedometer, was something new, a small strip of paper torn from the same notebook as the other notes. My heart beat once, hard, before I reached for it. This message was longer than the others. My own handwriting again, though older, more deliberate. It read, "When you see him again, don't stop. Keep driving. You'll understand later." A breath left my chest before I realized I'd been holding it. The message wasn't frightening. It was familiar, intimate, like advice from someone who loved me enough to trust I'd listen. I sat behind the wheel, the winter light spilling across the dashboard. Somewhere ahead of me, beyond whatever boundary separated one version of me from another, a moment was waiting. And for the first time since that night on the lonely road, I felt myself moving toward it. I didn't start the car right away. I just sat there with the newest note resting in my hand, letting the words settle into me. When you see him again, don't stop. It felt like advice someone gives themselves after learning a painful lesson. Gentle, careful, shaped by regret. A message from one version of a life to another. For a moment I wondered what he had lived through, what mistake he thought I might repeat if I didn't listen. Whatever it was, it had scarred him enough to send these warnings back to me, enough to step into my home, adjust my world, leave quiet echoes of himself for me to find. The thought should have frightened me. Instead, it made me feel strangely connected to him. This older me, carrying years I hadn't lived yet. I placed the note on the passenger seat and turned the key. The engine shuddered, then settled into its familiar idle. The cold inside the car dissolved slowly as the vents pushed warm air toward the windshield. Outside, the pines swayed, thin gusts of snow blowing off their branches like quiet signals I couldn't decipher. I backed out of the driveway and pulled onto the narrow road leading out of town. I didn't know where I was going. I wasn't following a map or instinct. I was following the feeling, that subtle tug in my chest that had started the moment I found the photograph, a pull that seemed to strengthen the farther I drove. The town faded behind me. The air thinned. The landscape opened into long stretches of quiet road lined by bare trees and untouched snow. I recognized some turns. Others felt unfamiliar. At one point, I realized I was heading in the direction of the road where I had first seen him, the lonely winding stretch where our headlights crossed in the dark. And as the miles passed, something strange happened. The air felt warmer, not by temperature, but by familiarity, like stepping into a memory still being written, a déjà vu that hadn't happened yet. About 12 miles outside town, the pines parted enough for me to see the hills in the distance. They looked almost identical to the ones in the photograph. The strange road markers, the angle of the slope, even the pale winter light felt the same. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I slowed the car, then stopped. The engine hummed softly, steady and warm. I stepped out into the cold air, my breath trailing upward in faint clouds. The silence wrapped around me, deep, thick, expectant. I held the photograph in one hand, comparing the scene before me with the image printed 3 years ahead of my life. It matched perfectly, as if I had arrived in a moment already waiting for me. I felt no fear, only a quiet sadness I didn't fully understand. Whatever path had brought me here, it wasn't the wrong morning. And yet, the feeling that I was close, so close, to something unfinished, settled through me like falling snow. I walked slowly along the edge of the road, my boots crunching through thin layers of frost. The hills in the distance stood exactly where they were in the photograph, as if waiting for me to recognize them. There was no wind, no movement, not even a distant car. It was the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world has stepped away for a moment, leaving you alone with whatever truth you're supposed to find. I held the photograph up again. My older self stood near a faded metal guardrail, the sky washed in pale light behind him. I followed the angle, scanning the road, half expecting to see him standing there. But the space was empty, quiet. I lowered the picture and breathed in the cold air, letting it settle into my chest. A part of me wondered if I had come too early, or too late. Maybe the moment meant for me hadn't arrived yet, or maybe it had already passed, and I was walking through the echo of it. The notes in my pocket felt heavier than paper, reminders that time wasn't moving in a straight line anymore. Not for me, not for the version of myself who had been here first. I stepped closer to the guardrail. The metal felt cold under my fingers. I leaned on it, looking out over the tree line. Nothing unusual at first, just the winter landscape stretching toward the horizon. But as I focused, I noticed something faint, a shimmer, a distortion, like heat waves rising off pavement in the summer. Subtle, barely there. I blinked. It vanished. I waited, breath held, eyes fixed on the spot. After a long moment, the distortion returned. A soft ripple in the air, bending light in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't dramatic, not supernatural in any loud or terrifying sense. It felt familiar, as if I were looking at a memory replaying behind a thin sheet of glass. I took a slow step toward it. The closer I moved, the more the air seemed to shift. Not warmer, not colder, just different. Like stepping into a space that remembered something I didn't. My heartbeat quickened, but not from fear, from recognition, from that strange heaviness I'd seen in the eyes of the man who passed me on that lonely road. My future self had stood here. I could feel it, not through sight, but through the strange ache that moved through me, as if my body recognized a moment my mind hadn't lived yet. I pulled out the second note, "Not yet," and read it again. Maybe I'd been chasing the wrong idea. Maybe these notes weren't warnings. Maybe they were timing, a rhythm, a way of making sure I didn't step into something before I was supposed to. I looked back at the shimmer in the air. It pulsed once, soft, slow, almost like breathing. And for the first time since that night, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet certainty that whatever had crossed my path wasn't gone. It was waiting, patiently, as if time itself were holding a place open for me. I stayed by that guardrail until the cold began to work its way into my bones. The shimmer in the air faded slowly, dissolving back into the winter light as if it had never been there at all. But something inside me had shifted. The stillness around me felt less like emptiness and more like anticipation, as though the moment had been waiting for me, not to solve anything, but simply to stand inside it. I looked down at the photograph again. The older version of myself seemed to watch me from across the years, his expression weary but patient, not warning me, not urging me to turn back, just waiting, as if he understood the weight of the moment better than I did, as if he knew I would need time, my own time, to understand what he had already lived. The notes in my pocket crinkled softly when I shifted my weight. "Not yet. Don't follow the wrong morning." And the last one, "When you see him again, don't stop." Together they didn't form instructions. They formed a rhythm, a gentle shaping of moments, nudging me forward without forcing me. A conversation between two versions of a life, separated by years but connected by something deeper than memory. I don't know if I'll see him again. Maybe I already have in ways I didn't recognize. Maybe the shimmer was the closest I'll ever get to crossing whatever boundary he slipped through. Or maybe it was simply the beginning, an opening I meant to approach in my own time. the way he once approached it in his. When I finally turned back toward the road, the sky had shifted to a soft silver, the kind that appears just before evening settles in. I slipped the photograph into my coat and started walking toward the car. Some part of me knew I wasn't stepping away from the moment. I was stepping toward the next one, quietly, steadily, following the path he'd already traced through a future that now feels just a little closer than it should.